Hi, I'm Maggie Burnett Stogner, Executive Director of the Center for Environmental Filmmaking at the School of Communication at American University in Washington, D.C., and of the CEF Impact Media Research Project funded by HHMI Tanglebank Studios. And it is my great pleasure to be here today with Tori Linder, Impact Producer, Path of the Panther, Danny Schmidt, Director and Principal of Danny Schmidt Films, and Vanessa Serrero, Executive Producer of Impact Media, National Geographic Society. And I just want to say congratulations on an outstanding film, Saving the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and for being selected as one of the Special Jury 2021 Jackson Wild Recognized Impact Campaigns. And I really welcome you all and thank you for your time. And I want to just dive right in. Let's talk about the film first. What was it that really motivated you to make this film? Why did this film have to be made now?
The interesting thing is that this film was not made in isolation, thinking about the story first. It was a real integral part of a long-term campaign. We at National Geographic had been supporting Carlton Ward, an explorer and photographer, since 2016 through his storytelling work, primarily photography, in support of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And this was a pivotal moment in that campaign that we felt was the time to really use the power of film to help move forward this really important Florida Wildlife Corridor Act. And I'll let Tori talk a little bit more about kind of why this was an important part in the campaign.
Absolutely. So as Vanessa just mentioned, the Florida Wildlife Corridor has really been a statewide initiative over the last decade, led by map makers, scientists, and storytellers here in Florida. It's a vision to protect a statewide corridor spanning nearly 18 million acres from Florida Bay in the south to the Georgia and Alabama borders, 10 million of which are currently protected, and 8 million of which remain unprotected. Our team at Path of the Panther had been really focusing with support from the National Geographic Society on telling the story of the wildlife that depend on this corridor, the wide-ranging species like the Florida panther and the Florida black bear. Though it became increasingly clear to us that it was also the voices of this landscape, the human narratives that were essential to share with our policymakers and decision makers, which really led to the identification of this film as a primary tool in inspiring them to act towards the preservation and protection of this landscape.
Was there, and I'm just going to follow up, and Tori, maybe you can just address this, but you have this long range campaign going over the last decade. Was there a particular catalyst that just made it really urgent to take this on or take this in another direction?
Well, that's a great question. Here in Florida, we're gaining 1,000 residents a day. On any given year, we're losing somewhere between 12 to 20 acres an hour to development. So there's no denying the pressure, the urgency is constant on our conservation community here in Florida. I think for our team, the moment to act politically became quite evident due to two key pieces. One of which was the Florida panther expanding its habitat into the northern range, which happened about 4 years ago. The first female panther was found north of the Caloosahatchee River, which gave us hope for the long-term recovery of the species and further stressed the urgent and global nature of protecting this corridor. But a few years later, the Florida legislature passed a sweeping toll road bill looking at bringing 3 highways through the center of the state, essentially right through the center of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And the world over, we know that the development follows roads. And fortunately, that legislation has subsequently been repealed. But in that moment in time, we realized we had to act now or it was going to be too late. at which time we had the pleasure of reaching out to Vanessa and beginning the process of really brainstorming what was possible.
Yeah, that's great.
And to add, oh, can
No,
I
go
just
ahead.
add to that? Yeah. Whenever we approach a project and consider, well, is this the right time to make a film? And if so, who is the audience and what can we expect to achieve? We think of our theory of change, which takes people from awareness all the way through to social and behavioral change. And this was an example of an opportunity to actually affect social change. And that was due to all the work that had been previously done by Carlton and Tori and others, and Danny as well, through photography, film, outreach. They began with awareness, and they built an engaged and supportive audience so that we could come in at this kind of tipping point and make a film that would address this immediate need. So again, the film wasn't an isolated piece of work. It was part of a long-term strategy.
And there are many ways to raise awareness or engage people, but Danny, maybe you can address specifically, what is it about film that really helps engage audiences?
Yeah, well, I have spent the last 5 years working in Florida, and it's not a place that I would normally have spent a lot of time if it weren't for the work that I've been doing with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And over the course of 5 years working on a panther feature doc, as well as several shorts for the Florida Wildlife Corridor, I've learned that in Florida, the conservation heroes aren't always the people that you would imagine. And I think that the power of film to really influence our emotions comes from this idea that you can put characters on the screen that might resonate with an entirely new audience than you had intended. And so I think for this film and this project and our intended purpose, we wanted to use this emotive power of film to try to find audiences that we hadn't reached with our previous films in Florida. And film is an amazing tool. The combination of visuals and the empathy that you're able to generate with the documentary camera, in combining all the other elements, is just, I feel like it's unmatched. It's more important than a lecture or a pamphlet. And so to combine all of these things, and do it in a way that it's our approach is targeted. I mean, it's the reason we do this job, because we feel like it can make a difference. And when it does, it is just, I mean, it's the greatest thing ever. The process of making films is really fun, and I think that's what brought us to this originally. But when we can have an impact like this one did, it's really super gratifying.
And I'd just like to follow up, because the film just takes us, it immerses us, it takes us on a journey. We really feel like we're right there with the characters. We know relatability is super important for engaging and forging that connection through film, and even that empathy and strengthening that sense of empathy with the subject matter. How did you go about casting your characters?
Yeah, this was a long process, and I think Tori and I can tag team this one. As in any film, you spend so much time in pre-production and development, making sure that by the time you get out there and point your camera at something, you're confident that you made the right choice in terms of location and character and the things that you set out to film. And so this project was no different. We spent months and months on the phone with ranchers and loggers and fishermen and fisherwomen and people that work in the tourism industry in Florida. And we met so many more characters than we were able to squeeze into this film, unfortunately. So look for a sequel. We talked to people. We were casting both based on the characters themselves and their geographic location within the state, because it was important that, Florida is really big and it has very diverse geography, and we wanted to make sure that we represented the whole state from north to south, because that's the idea of the Wildlife Corridor, is that it would provide this passage from the southern tip of Florida and the Everglades all the way north to the border. And so, yeah, the casting process it was long, but it was really fun, and it sort of forged a even deeper connection with Florida than I had before. And I'll let Tori jump in here. We were on the phone a lot with a lot of different people for many months.
Well, Maggie, I think when we first came up with the idea of creating this film, it was with a very particular audience in mind and a very specific goal of inspiring lasting legislative change here in Florida. And so, working back from that place, it was clear to us that we needed to remind our policymakers and decision makers that protecting the Florida Wildlife Corridor, protecting Florida's environment as a whole, wasn't just beneficial for our wildlife, but also our people and our economy. And we worked to identify characters that, as Danny mentioned, were relatable to any Floridian. This is one of the largest states in the nation. It spans a wide range of habitats, but also cultures and economies. Pensacola and Miami could not be more different. It's night and day. So that geographic element was certainly key. And, we see that in following the story of Lynetta Griner up on the Swanee River, really in that Big Bend region of Florida, then down to Florida Bay with Benny Blanco and the far southern tip. But the other point we wanted to drive home, we wanted to make sure that we hit the leading drivers of Florida's economy. So we covered the cattle industry, the timber industry, aquaculture, and tourism, which are ultimately agriculture and tourism are the two leading drivers of Florida's $1 trillion GDP. So that was a priority for us. And then within that, also communicating that this mattered for the next generation of Floridians moving here as well. We really saw that in the stories of Cedar Key, where you have a whole new segment of people arriving because they see hope and they see potential in a sustainable economy driven by aquaculture.
You did a brilliant job of casting the characters. Each one feels very, very real, very authentic. They're not spouting from, some common, pamphlets with the same message, and I really feel like we're taken into their worlds and we understand why they care as individuals.
I do want to make sure it's clear that every character chosen was a natural voice for the landscape. They weren't corridor advocates necessarily. I mean, we found real people, some of which had never heard of the concept of the corridor before. Certainly for Ian and Gretchen Stone, who just moved here from Kansas and live on the water. And, in theory, they experience everyday connections to what's happening upstream because they're working in an estuary. But their sentiments, their voices, it was very true and authentic for every one of these characters.
Vanessa, you and I have talked a lot about this theory of change framework and how to formulate films and impact campaigns. And it really is about identifying very clearly, what is it that you want to change? Who can help you affect that change? And how can you best engage those people who can help affect that change? So can you just apply that kind of larger framework to this project? Because I think it's really a framework that can help a lot of people in figuring out what they do with their films and impact campaigns.
Sure. I think due to our legacy in television and broad audience filmmaking, there's a tendency to always assume the most people, that your goal is to reach the most people possible, and then produce stories with that in mind. But when we're talking about impact filmmaking, we're doing exactly what you just said. Really flipping that model and thinking about your goal and your audience first. So this was a perfect case study for that, because this film, the primary audience is not the general public. It's not it wasn't intended for television or broad distribution primarily. It was intended for a very small audience of lawmakers who could help us achieve the goal of protecting the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So then all of our creative choices were informed by that. Instead of by mass audience appeal, all of our creative choices were informed by the smaller audience and very direct goal. And that did make a difference in the characters we chose to feature, in how we constructed the narrative, in the emotions we evoked, the themes. So I think it was an interesting experience for all of us to approach a creative project with a different set of parameters.
And very effectively, because you did. I mean, I'd love for you to talk about the successes you've had. And here was this very direct, audience of a handful of lawmakers, and you did achieve what you set out to achieve. So Vanessa, Danny, Tori?
Well, the thing I could add to that, I think this is a good model for conservation filmmakers in general, because we're always talking about reaching across the aisle and engaging new audiences and this need to stop preaching to the choir. Well, in order to do that, it's not just about distribution. We really have to rethink how we change our storytelling. And this, we talked a little bit about character choice already, and that was part of this rethinking of the narrative. And then the second main point, I think, is the emotions we tried to evoke. I think a lot of times conservation films can go for like anger or fear or awe even. And while we did incorporate a little bit of those, we really focused on these emotions of pride and love, which I think was a very different way of telling a story. So pride in our heritage and love of family and this desire to leave a legacy.
I'd love for another example or two of that. So Danny, maybe you can chime in on an example of that, how that narrative differed, how that messaging differed when you're trying to reach policymakers and not just more conservationists who already support your message.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something we talked about recently, is that, for years we've been attending environmental film festivals from Jackson to DC to IWFF, and we have seen many, many films over the years with conservation heroes as our protagonists on the screen, the sort of typical ones, the ones that we cast because we want to hang out with them, or we see value in their message because it resonates with our own feelings. And I think by sort of flipping that around and saying, there's more than one kind of conservationist. There's more than one type of person in Florida that cares about this landscape. There are ranchers that wake up every morning and take pride in their work and take pride in the land that they've protected. And finding those characters that, might not necessarily get the typical shine of being in a documentary, by finding them and facilitating their voice, using the tools that we have as filmmakers to put their voice on the screen in a way that they want it to be heard, to take their message to the audience that we hope will listen, was really important. And during the casting process, you're really trying to sell this idea to these characters that this is a worthwhile investment of their time, because as filmmakers know, the process of making a film is exhaustive. It can be sort of a taking. And by empowering this group of people to find their voice or to lend their voice to this film, it was an ask that we believed in, but we needed them to believe in this also. And so one of the other factors that influenced not only the way that we made this film, but the way that we were sort of compelled to distribute it was COVID. And COVID has affected all elements of filmmaking. And so this film was made entirely during COVID. We piled into an RV with a lot of N95 masks during the height of COVID in Florida last July. And we traveled the state from north to south. And what we felt like we were able to do is to capture the essence of these characters and the essence of Florida and the landscape of Florida as a character and take it to Tallahassee and put it on screens in Tallahassee for lawmakers so they could say, oh, right, I live in this place. You know, my office might be in the, you know, in the basement of this Capitol building, but I'm part of this place that is beautiful and important. And there's ranchers like Carrie Lightsey just down the road, or loggers like Lynetta Griner just down the road who represent, you know, the way that I feel about Florida. And so COVID sort of like forced us to take this beautiful story and these beautiful people and locations and find a way to put it on a screen so it makes sense and get it in the hands of these people. So I hope I answered your question.
If I may add as well, I will, you know, just to reiterate Vanessa's point that we made a really intentional effort here to paint a positive story, and one in which, frankly, all Floridians could see their legacy in. And that was so clear to me in seeing the response of individuals who did watch the film. Ultimately, we achieved a bipartisan win here in Florida. The Florida Wildlife Corridor Act passed in the spring legislative session with bipartisan unanimous support. Additionally, our state legislature committed a total of $400 million towards the Florida Forever program to acquire key properties within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And, you know, that was a win beyond our wildest expectations for Florida's natural environment, but it was exciting to see that it was also building off of the legacy of conservation in this state. As I mentioned earlier, the Florida Wildlife Corridor is comprised of 18 million acres, 10 million of which have already been protected. We have 4 million acres of contiguous public lands here in Southwest Florida. And to see the identity that Floridians have in that narrative, in that legacy of conservation continue has been overwhelming and just absolutely thrilling.
Congratulations. That's such a huge win. I mean, it's inspiring all the way around. The idea of creating corridors, I think, has become more and more important. You know, the idea of creating corridors has been something that people are really recognizing as absolutely key to conservation. And I see this as a model that people could take across the country and really use as, you know, in every single state as a message for here's how we need to come together, cross the aisle, solutions oriented, and work together to create these corridors for wildlife. So I hope it's used as that way too, not just in Florida, but really as a model for states across the country to really think about how they can affect this.
I agree entirely. I like to say if we can do it in Florida, we can do it anywhere. But that's very true when you look at the reality of the development pressure here. And I've been so encouraged to see that Virginia, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, they've all recently followed suit, passing different forms of wildlife corridor legislation. What's just occurred here in Florida was the most significant by nature of the state's investment in land protection though. And we really hope that we will see our colleagues here in Florida encouraging theirs around the country to take action in 2022.
I hope you're, yes, just yes. Vanessa, let me come back to you because, you know, measuring impact, I mean, in this case, you had a very clear-cut goal and you had amazing success. And it sounds like success that will continue to build a very strong network corridor of relationships among the policymakers. Not every project is so clear-cut, and I'm just wondering what advice you could give to filmmakers, to organizations, conservation organizations, to funders, to commissioners. You know, how do you set out and work toward that clear goal? And then how do you put in place those kind of measuring evaluative tools to understand, did you actually meet the benchmarks that you set out to meet?
Well, I think this is a work in progress for us at National Geographic and for the whole industry. But we're working on my team a very clear theory of change, and then assigning metrics to each step, so that you can know, well, if I'm trying to create, if at this point in the project I'm trying to create awareness, well, this is how I measure it. And in that case, maybe it is by volume, or maybe it's awareness amongst a specific audience, and you measure how you've reached that audience. If I'm trying to generate support, well, then I'll measure that in a different way. Maybe it's by a number of donations, or the number of times an organization has used the film to build support amongst specific constituents. So there are, I think we're still trying to develop that, but the crux of it is that you have to really be clear about what a reasonable goal is, and then that you're making something that fits that, and if you're wanting to create legislative change, then you shouldn't necessarily be making a film for television, because those two things don't match up. If you're trying to create awareness, then yes, but not, so I think that's a model we're working on, and assigning the metrics is our next step.
Yeah, that's.
But I would say, yeah, sorry. Well, the one thing to add is that it does take some forethought and really putting the time in before you even decide what story you're telling. So that's the lesson we've learned, is, as Danny said, that the number of weeks in pre-production gets increased a little bit, because you do want to be really intentional about the story you're going to tell, because film, any media, is a big investment. So you want to be sure, if you're going to make that investment of time and resources, it's aligned with what your goal is in an achievable way.
Yeah, because we have depended for so many decades on ratings, and then more recently on likes, but that only tells us so much. So this idea of, and we talked about this, the research that I'm doing, this idea of different ways to have impact, and we have this incredibly fragmented media landscape today. So how do you really target those audiences that can affect the change, and different ways to measure impact, so you can come back around to funders and say, yes, this did make a difference. That I think the more tools we have, the more everybody can see, how to harness compelling storytelling in really powerful ways. So yeah, and I really congratulate you all. Is there anything that, in hindsight, you would have done differently?
I would have done it sooner.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to the point we made earlier, we're losing 12 to 20 acres an hour here in Florida. And every minute matters. I feel that urgency now more than ever. And, just one thing I want to add, if I can, is that creating this film, this entire production from start to finish, has been such a positive, joyful experience working with these teams, to see everyone aligned towards a common mission and goal. And certainly in light of a lot of challenges with COVID, but from our supporters at the Florida Wildlife Corridor Coalition, to our production team on the ground, to the team at NGS, that urgency, that mission at hand was clear, and it was incredible to be a part of.
Yeah, I don't have really anything that I would have changed, given the success and what we pulled off during the time we are at in the world. I think is really impressive, and huge thanks to everybody in Florida and at National Geographic that made this possible. As a filmmaker, we just love to point our cameras at things in good light, and we're like, we did our job. But really, that's not enough anymore. And I think that we're so saturated with beautiful pictures that don't have much meaning. And I think to be able to create images with meaning it's been an amazing highlight of my career. to the other filmmakers that are watching this, young filmmakers, whatever stage you're at, I think my takeaway as a filmmaker from this project is that when you're thinking about an issue that you want to impact and use film as part of your tool set for making impact, I think it's important to sort of like, typically at every step in making a film, we're thinking, does this shot serve the story? Does this edit serve the story? Does this character serve the story? Which is important because we want to create films that tell a story because those will have the greatest impact. But I think we also need to be asking, does this character serve the impact that we're trying to make? Does this edit serve that purpose as well? And your films can have impact without having a big budget or connected lawmakers at the Capitol. But I will say that when you're putting together your film idea, you might think a little bit differently about the coalition that you build around your project. So rather than, only seeking out the best sound person or cinematographer or editor, you might think, who should I consult at levels of government or conservation that know what is required to make the change that you're hoping to make with this film. And so, I would consider building a bigger network to think about how you might get that stuff done.
Excellent advice.
I think that's a great point. And what I'd like to commend as well is that this was not a project done by just a filmmaker or just a conservation organization. So many groups came together to make this possible. And what I loved about it is that there was this sense of respect and appreciation and support amongst all of us for the various skills and expertise that this amazingly talented team brought to the table. And I don't think I would change anything about this project, but I would use this project as an example for what we can do in the future. So I think it's been a highlight of my career as well, and just a good example for how National Geographic can help engage and with the power of our brand and storytelling.
Thank you all. This was really a great conversation and really insightful. And congratulations again on just a tremendous success with the film and the Impact campaign. Really appreciate your time. And we'll wrap it up here.